somewhere in the north of England, in a lecture hall that usually hosts debates about black holes and quantum mechanics, a mathematician once stood up and said something that stopped a room full of physicists cold. He said, "I believe in science, and it is precisely because I believe in science that I believe in God." Now hold that thought, because in a few minutes I am going to tell you why I claim like that. I claim from the world of pure logic and mathematics is about to walk onto a stage in front of thousands of worship leaders. Not scientists, not philosophers, worship leaders, songwriters, the people who write the words you sing on Sunday morning. And if you are wondering what a mathematician has to do with music, stay with me, because the answer to that question is going to surprise you more than you expect. Let me ask you something first. When was the last time you asked yourself whether what you sing is actually true? Not whether it moves you. Not whether the chord progression gives you chills, whether it is true. Because here is an uncomfortable fact. An entire generation is walking into churches, lifting their hands, singing words about a risen Christ, a designed universe, a purposeful cosmos, and then walking out into a culture that tells them 5 days a week, that none of that can be intellectually defended. That faith is a private feeling, that the real thinkers, the serious people have moved on. And so a kind of quiet fracture opens up in the soul of the worshipper. The heart sings one thing on Sunday. The mind quietly doubts it by Wednesday. This is the fracture that a conference like Sing 2026 is trying to heal. And it cannot be healed with a better melody. It can only be healed with better reasons. This is where the mathematician comes in. For decades now, one of the most formidable voices in the science and faith conversation has built his entire career on a very simple but very sharp observation that the great atheist thinkers of our age, Richard Dawkins, the late Christopher Hitchens, and most famously, the brilliant physicist Stephen Hawking, often smuggle enormous philosophical assumptions into what look like purely scientific statements, without ever telling their audience they've done it. When Stephen Hawking wrote in his final book that because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. A wave of headlines declared that physics had finally buried God. But listen carefully to that sentence. It says the universe created itself because there is a law of gravity. But a law of gravity is not nothing. A law is a mathematical description of how something behaves. You cannot have a law of gravity floating in a void with nothing for it to govern and call that nothing. That is not nothing. That is something remarkably fine-tuned, remarkably orderly, and remarkably in need of an explanation. As one Oxford philosopher of science quipped at the time, this was rather like saying that the blueprint of a house could build the house without a builder, brick or land to build it on. It sounds profound until you actually stop and think about what was just claimed. And this refusal to stop and think this willingness to be dazzled by scientific language while the logic underneath quietly collapses, is exactly what an entire generation raised on TikTok and 20 second clips is most vulnerable to. Which brings us to the strange and wonderful reason a mathematician is being invited to speak to musicians. Because worship leaders are, whether they realize it or not, the last line of theological defense many young Christians will ever encounter. Think about that for a moment. A 22-year-old sits through half a sermon on his phone. He forgets 90% of what the pastor says by Tuesday. But the song he will sing in the shower, hum in the car, replay at 2 in the morning when the anxiety hits. The song becomes theology set to memory. Augustine himself, 16 centuries ago, worried about exactly this. He said that when music moves us more than the truth it carries, we sin. But when the truth and the music move us together, something powerful and holy happens. The lyric becomes doctrine, and doctrine sung is doctrine remembered. So here is the uncomfortable question this conference is daring to ask its songwriters. What happens when the song is beautiful, but the theology inside it cannot survive 5 minutes of honest scrutiny? What happens when we sing, "You spoke it all into existence," with total confidence on Sunday, but have never once given our congregation the tools to answer the confident atheist colleague who corners them at work on Monday and says, "Come on, science has moved past all that." This is precisely the gap that thinkers in the Lennox tradition have spent their whole careers closing. And I want to give you right now one example, one single argument that has reportedly changed the minds of hardened skeptics in a debate hall, because I think it will change something in you too. It is called the fine-tuning argument. And if you have never heard it stated properly, prepare to have your mind rearranged in the next 90 seconds. For the universe to permit the existence of any life whatsoever, not humans specifically, just any life, anywhere, a staggering number of physical constants have to be calibrated with a precision that borders on the unbelievable. The strength of gravity, the strong nuclear force holding atomic nuclei together, the cosmological constant governing the expansion of space itself. Physicists have calculated that if the cosmological constant were altered by roughly 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, a number so large it dwarfs every grain of sand on every beach on Earth, multiplied many times over, the universe will either half-collapse itself in an instant or expanded so violently no galaxy, no atom heavier than hydrogen could ever have formed. Sir Martin Rees, the former president of the Royal Society and hardly a man given to religious sentiment, has spent an entire career cataloguing what he calls the 6 numbers that had to be exactly right for a universe capable of producing anything as complex as a single living cell, let alone a human mind capable of writing a worship song about its own creator. Now, the atheist response to this is usually one of 2 moves. The first is to say, well, if it weren't this way, we simply wouldn't be here to observe it. So, of course, we find ourselves in a universe fine, tuned for us. But notice what that explanation actually explains. Nothing. It tells you why, given a fine-tuned universe, you'd expect to find yourself inside it. It tells you nothing about why there is a fine-tuned universe available to find yourself inside in the first place. It is a bit like a man who survives a firing squad of 100 expert marksmen, all of whom miss, and who then reasons, well, I wouldn't be here thinking about this if they hadn't all missed. So there's nothing here that needs explaining. No, something deeply needs explaining. The unlikely event of survival cries out for a reason, not a shrug. The second move is to invoke a multiverse, an infinite number of unobserved universes, each with different constants, so that ours, however unlikely, was bound to turn up somewhere. And here is where the mathematician's training becomes so valuable, because he will simply ask calmly, with a raised eyebrow, what is the empirical evidence for this infinite number of unobservable universes? None. Not one shred. It is, quite literally, an article of faith, a metaphysical commitment adopted specifically to avoid a theological conclusion, dressed up in the borrowed authority of physics. As one prominent astrophysicist has been quoted as saying, privately, the multiverse is not so much a scientific theory as it is a philosophy of desperation. You are free to believe it, but do not for one moment let anyone tell you that believing in an undetectable infinity of universes is more scientifically modest than believing in one creator. It is not. It is simply a different faith commitment, and a rather more expensive one. Do you see now why a mind trained to dissect an argument down to its final assumption has something urgent to say to the people writing our songs? Because our songwriters need to know that when they write the line, you hold it all together, they are not writing sentiment. They are writing something a serious scientist takes seriously enough to spend a career defending. But I promised you this was not really about one man or even about physics. It is about something closer to your chest than any equation. So let me bring this all the way home. C.S. Lewis, a man who never wrote a worship song in his life, but who shaped more Christian imagination than perhaps anyone in the last century, once wrote that if he found in himself a desire which nothing in this world could satisfy, the most probable explanation was that he was made for another world. Think about that ache you carry. The one that shows up at 2 a.m., the one that no achievement, no relationship, no amount of applause after a set has ever fully silenced. Lewis called it joy. Not happiness, but a stab of longing, a homesickness for a country you've never visited but somehow remember. Every honest worship song is an attempt to name that H and point it somewhere real. And that is precisely why it cannot afford to be theologically careless. If the ache is real and the answer offered in the song is false, you have not comforted anyone. you have only anesthetized them for a little while longer. This is why a mathematician stands in front of songwriters and does not talk about hymnody or melody or the Nashville chord number system. He talks about truth. He talks about the historical evidence for the resurrection, the fact that the earliest Christian creed, which secular historians date to within a handful of years of the crucifixion itself, already contains the claim that Christ was seen alive by more than 500 people at once. A claim so specific and so falsifiable that the writer practically dares his readers to go and check it against living witnesses. He talks about the origin of the moral law within us. The fact that when a man like Dawkins insists that concepts like good and evil are illusions produced by selfish genes, he still, without fail, writes with genuine moral outrage about cruelty and injustice, borrowing a currency of right and wrong that his own worldview cannot mint. This is not a man attacking science. This is a man asking the fundamental Socratic question underneath every claim. Does this actually hold together, or does it merely sound impressive? And here, finally, is why this matters more than any conference schedule, more than any keynote slot, more than any single argument I've given you tonight. Because every single person listening to this right now is going to die. I say that not to be morbid, but because it is the only honest way to introduce the question that actually matters. We spend our days as though we have unlimited time to sort out what we truly believe. We assume there will be a later moment, some quieter season, when we will finally settle the question of whether the resurrection really happened, whether the universe really was designed, whether the songs we've been singing our whole lives were pointing at something true or merely something beautiful. But none of us is promised that quieter season. Somewhere, right now, a man is sitting in a doctor's office, hearing the words, "A few years, perhaps." And in that moment, I promise you, the question of whether Christianity is true stops being an academic exercise and becomes the only question in the room. So let me leave you with something sharper than a statistic and more permanent than any argument I have offered you tonight. If you knew, not vaguely, not someday, but knew that you had years left, not decades, what would you want to have been true? Would you want to have spent your one life defending a story you never actually tested? Or would you want to have done the hard, honest, sometimes frightening work of finding out, really finding out whether the words you've been singing your whole life are the realest thing you have ever said? That is the question underneath every note at that conference. That is the question underneath every question I have raised with you today. It is not really about John Lennox. It was never really about him. It is about you and the years you have been given and what you intend to build your one life upon before those years run out. I would love to know what you're thinking. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if this made you stop and think, even for a moment, please consider subscribing. There is more of this coming, and I would be glad to have you along for it.